So, Alan, you're a historian of Germany, modern Germany, and historian of science as well. And those are, I think, unique perspectives that you have brought to the article that Chris Bashford has already praised, and that I hope others will have a chance to read, from international security, about complexity and Clausewitz. Thank you for coming in from the West Coast, where you now make your home. Please, take it away.
Thank you. We were asked, among other things, or some of us were asked to talk about the value of Clausewitz's thought and of On War today. So let me give you a few of my thoughts, because I believe that On War is complex enough, and Clausewitz's thinking was eclectic enough, and his evolution from his childhood or experiences of age 12 or so in war for the first time, straight through to the end of his life, meant that he evolved sufficiently that there's something for everybody in Clausewitz's thinking. That is, what you read in On War is what you're prepared to read. What you see is what you're prepared to see. And that explains one of the reasons all of us see different things in Clausewitz. One of the major things I think that we should take away from Clausewitz, that we should regard as a value, is his concern for the self-education of the commander. And that On War was prepared specifically to encourage the self-education of officers, of commanders in particular. Another is that Clausewitz always understood war in terms of its context. He understood that context to be a political context. That as an historian, I'm in the context business. I mean, that's what historians do. We talk about context. We study context. We try to understand phenomena in their context. Clausewitz understood war as having a context, so there's a conduct and then a context, but he also was interested in the nature of war. And those three things are interlocked in Clausewitz's thinking. They're interactive in his thinking, because everything was interactive in his thinking. And they forced him to engage in very rigorous intellectual inquiry, which is basically a model for inquiry in general. It seems to me that the rigor with which he pursued his ideas and the self-testing that he engaged in over his lifetime is a very important model for how to think about important things. And he came to the conclusions, in many ways, I believe, that war was fundamentally unpredictable. Now, saying that here in this building may be a problem for some folks, because many of you are committed to the idea of trying to figure out at least something about what future war is going to look like, or how to conduct war today on the basis of its predictable elements. But Clausewitz, I believe, thought war was fundamentally, inherently, intrinsically unpredictable. That war doesn't have chance come in extrinsically to it. War generates chance. War generates possibility. War, in that sense, is sort of, well, creative, and changes things. And because it changes things, old precepts almost immediately are forced often to go out the window. And you have to actually develop something new on the spot often. So you can study war all you want in some sort of peacetime context, but once the war begins, you have to adapt. And Clausewitz, I think, saw that repeatedly in his own lifetime. He was involved in a number of wars, was in combat many times, and understood how much things change in the happening, how much wars make themselves up as they go, so to speak. He also saw that each war was therefore an emergent phenomenon. That is, what you mean by emergence is that you can understand the parts of something, but the whole itself cannot be deduced somehow from the parts. The whole itself is something beyond the parts. That's part of what the word emergent means in the context of which it's used in the sciences. And he saw each war as basically an emergent phenomena based on its character. And he talks about the character in the Trinity. There are two trinities in On War. One is more about the nature of war, more abstract, and then there's a second one that's a bit more concrete and meant to say something about the war in his time. And wars as they happen become emergent phenomena. They change in their conduct and the context in which they occur. They change as a matter of use of energy, use of resources, use of intentions and counter-intentions, and the fact that the opponent is, of course, something animate that's reacting to you, not something inanimate that you can unilaterally act upon. And all of this meant that Clausewitz came to the conclusion, as part of the self-education of the commander, that judgment is what really mattered. Way down deep, that's one of the major, I think, lessons that you can learn from reading On War, that the judgment of the commander is the most important thing that you can bring to this ever-changing phenomenon, this ever-evolving phenomenon. Chris and John mentioned an article I wrote some time ago that has been somewhat influential, where I talked about war as a nonlinear phenomenon in Clausewitz's thinking. Let me explain for just a moment what I mean by that. nonlinear is one of those words that negates what it's supposed to, right? It's something not linear. And linearity is a very simple concept. It says that things, the whole is equal to the sum of the parts. You can take something that you want to address, break it into its component parts, address the component parts, and put it back together again, and you get the whole. Bureaucracy is one of those quintessential linearization techniques in our social history. And of course, you folks don't know anything about bureaucracy here in the Pentagon. I understand that. But that's one of the problems with linearization, is that the assumption is that the whole is going to equal the sum of the parts. And that is not much the way the world actually operates, certainly not in war. The other precept of linearity is that things are proportional. That changes in input produce proportional changes in output, and whatever you're dealing with. And more, a lot of disproportionality is the norm. So that Clausewitz, I believe, understood war as a phenomenon that violated these two requirements of linearity. He was actually very adept in the sciences and math. He got good high marks and was notable for his ability, by the way. This is not something that he talked about lightly. He understood what he was doing, and was up on the current science of his time, and sometimes ahead of it. So my concern is how to understand this nonlinear phenomenon. Clausewitz, I think, tells us repeatedly, basically, that because of the elements of interaction that are intrinsic in war, he uses the word Wechselwirkung. The war is a beständige Wechselwirkung, der Gegenseitigen. It's this constant interaction at all levels, actually, not just between you and your opponent, but within your own army, between the politicians and the military figures. Interaction is the norm in war. And because it's this interactive phenomenon, you cannot isolate variables from each other. They interact with each other. And once that happens, you get mathematical nonlinearity. And therefore, you get all kinds of exponentials. You get, hyperboles, if you would map these things into geometry from algebra. What you end up with is a whole bunch of phenomena that explode, that collapse, that do things that are unexpected. That is commonplace in the nonlinear phenomena of our world. And by the way, very little of our world is actually linear, even though we try to take linear approximations of nonlinear phenomena. We do that all the time. Anybody here who's trained in engineering or the sciences knows about this. We take linear approximations. But the mathematician Stanislav Ulam in the early 50s, working with the early computers, talked about the fact that discussing nonlinearity is like talking about all of zoology as non-elephant animals. The world is nonlinear. The universe is nonlinear. And Clausewitz understood this in a way that was, I think, fairly sophisticated. And as a consequence, understood the unpredictabilities that emerged from nonlinear interactions and from things that he then called friction, for example. Everybody knows about the term friction in Clausewitz's work, and he means that in very specific ways. He means that it's not just the resistant element walking in water. He talks about movement in water being resistant, right? Friction's like that. But it's also the noise in the system. That's another kind of friction that I think he is very aware of. He talks about chance as being something that the very last thing that war lacks. And he talks about chance from everything from stochastic processes, perturbations from outside, to amplification of a microcause to a macro effect, to analytical blindness, the way we are prepared to see the world a certain way, and we don't understand what's actually happening. It appears as chance, even though later on we might say, oh, now I can explain what happened. It looks like chance when it happens. And out of all of this comes the sense that war is something, I think, rather different from what most of us think it is. My conclusion, one of the reasons I talked about this in October, is that Clausewitz decided that war could not be approached as a science. He asks in a fairly famous passage whether war is an art or a science, and he says basically neither of the above. It's more akin to commerce or to the politics, or politique, which is both politics and policy. He said war could not be a science. And I'm interested very much in why not. That seems to me a very logical question to answer. And my contention is that Clausewitz ended up viewing war as fundamentally closer to organic than to mechanistic phenomena. That's a big statement. Closer to, I doubt that war's alive, but he sees war as emergent. He sees war as evolving. He sees each war itself as evolving. He understands elements within it that he refers to as an organisches Ganze, an organic whole. This was a term that was used in the 1820s and 30s by a lot of people, including Hegel, and including Schelling, including a lot of people who were philosophers and thinkers of various sorts. Clausewitz was part and parcel of the context of his own time. And the pervasiveness of this concept of Wechselwirkung, of interaction, and the inextricable interactive relationship between the part and the whole, are some of the key indicators of the way he thought of wars more akin to organic phenomena than akin to mechanistic phenomena. He says repeatedly, it's not mechanistic. He says that over and over again. You cannot apply the precepts and the rules and the formula that deal with the mechanistic world to war. It's something else. And it turns out that the philosopher Immanuel Kant had recently, by 1790 or so, come up with a volume about creativity, human creativity in art, the creativity of nature, and basically came to a conclusion that what we call biology, that is the study of the living world, could never be a science. Basically because living things seem to have purpose. There's a teleological element. The cause and effect relationships are not as important as correlation. And after all, correlation is not causation. And Kant believed that you needed cause-effect relationships that you would find in Newtonian mechanics to have a science, and said specifically, the more you can put mathematics into a subject, the more you can make a science of it. I think most of us actually sort of implicitly agree with that. And Kant felt that organic phenomena are not subject to mathematization. There could be, as he called it, no Newton of the blade of grass. Nobody could have an F equals ma of living things. And Clausewitz, therefore, as a good Kantian, and he started out his life as a Kantian, in many ways Kant's thinking is put into on more different stages, he came to a conclusion that basically war cannot be a science, because it's too much akin to studying the living world. And if Clausewitz is right, I'm going to add this little piece here.
No, please.
If you'll, right? And war is inherently more akin to biological than to mechanistic phenomena. It would be useful, I contend, perhaps even more helpful, to look at war through the eyes of biologists as through the eyes of physicists, chemists, mathematicians, and engineers who dominate our thinking in the armed forces. And the views and life experiences of each of us very much affect what we think about the world. Yet the views and life experiences of biologists are woefully underrepresented in the decision-making and command positions in the officer corps of the armed services. I think they should not be.
Dr. Beyerchen, thank you for that. And we should mention that I know you've been curious to know, as we talked about when you came, most of the military academies don't even have a biology degree anymore, and most people who studied are going into the health science field in some way rather than to the operating force. And in my current position, we're going to find for you, I know for the book you're writing that goes more into this question, the number of biology majors who are part of the various services and part of the operating force there as well. So